Sacrificing Families by Leisy J. Abrego. Chapter 2. Why Parents Migrate. Esperanza, who has lived in the United States for over 12 years, vividly recalls the day she last saw her daughter, Margarita. The little girl was only 2 years old at the time, and Esperanza had been feeling suffocated by the scarcity that pervaded their lives. Being a single mother was difficult, and although her own mother had tried to help her together, they could not overcome the tremendous poverty that had been their reality for many years. She had been doing agricultural work in the fields for over a year, but was only sinking further and further into debt. She was struck in a cycle. Her weekly wages were gone within hours of getting paid. They were barely enough to cover existing debts at the local store. And for the rest of each week, she begged hesitant sellers to put groceries on her tab. You can't live like that all your life, she thought. So Esperanza finally considered more seriously her friend's suggestion that they migrate to the United States. That's the only way we're going to make enough money to feed our children, her friend had repeated many times. As the oldest of three, Esperanza felt especially responsible for her mother and younger siblings. Her father's untimely death during her childhood condemned her family to poverty, but she did her best to stay focused on school. When she was in the 10th grade, however, her mother informed her that she could not afford all the kids' schooling. So Esperanza would have to drop out of school to help pay for the younger kids' expenses. All of the changes were stressful for Esperanza, so she thought comfort in the company of her then boyfriend. By the age of 17, she was pregnant. The baby's father, also a teenager, was never involved in the child's life, and Esperanza raised her daughter as a single mother. By the time she was 19, she felt overwhelmed. I felt the responsibility to at least make enough money to feed them all. She wanted her siblings to get more schooling, and she was determined not to let her daughter grow up in such misery. Still, Esperanza was paralyzed at the thought of leaving her daughter. She struggled for weeks to make the decision and postponed this trip several days. Even after her best friend had arranged for a smuggler, through a stroke of luck, the smuggler agreed to take Esperanza without charging her for the trip up front. She could work to pay off her debt after arriving in the United States. And still she hesitated. It was sheer desperation that ultimately pushed her to go through with her migration decision. My heart was boiling with sadness. I would watch my daughter play and say, God, please give me the strength to leave. One night I put my daughter to bed and she turned to face the wall. And she always used to hug me. But she didn't that day. I think she could sense my departure. And I lay awake crying. And my little girl wakes up and she tells me, Mommy, I want milk, crying. I want milk, Mommy, crying. Those words gave me the strength to leave. And I told her, there is no milk, baby, but I promise I will get you some. And she tells me, I love you, Mommy. And I tell her I love you too, and she fell asleep until morning. That morning the bus was coming. That was the bus that always sounded the horn loudly at the entrance to the town. And it started. I changed my daughter. I put on her pink sandals, and I sat her on the table. And I told my mother, hold her, Mom. I leave her in your hands. Love her as if she were your own daughter. Esperanza sobbed intensely as she boarded that bus. In her gut, she knew it would be many years before she would see her family again. In her retelling of the story 13 years later, she cried throughout our 3-hour conversation, but was especially upset while recalling the painful details of that morning when she last saw her daughter. Esperanza's story is not unique. Mothers and fathers at different moments in El Salvador's history have faced great personal, political, and financial barriers, and at times worked through immense hesitation before taking the steps to migrate. In every case, and for various reasons, insurmountable desperation ultimately forced them to push through their pain and leave their children with their caregivers. This with the knowledge that they may not see them again for many years. This chapter provides details about the economic and political situation in El Salvador that powerfully circumscribes these families' options, even when individuals do not personally locate the source of their hardship within this broad context. The macro conditions are woven in with the narratives of the parents to reveal how they understand and give meaning to their departure and subsequent family separation. In most cases, it is a story of subdued hope following a deep sense of despair that inspired them to leave. Civil War. Throughout its history, El Salvador has been deeply stratified, with only a small elite benefiting from the labor of the vast majority of the population living in poverty. In response, Salvadorans, especially males, have historically migrated seasonally within the region in search of work. Thus, migration and seasonal family separation became a common strategy of survival that would later help to expand and normalize the formation of thousands of transnational families separated by great distances and multiple national borders. Through much of the 1900s, only those with sufficient resources were able to travel, often as tourists and sometimes as laborers, all the way to the United States. It was not until the early 1980s, when the brutality of the Civil War extended throughout El Salvador, that men and women and entire families began to migrate to the United States in larger numbers. Not expecting that the U.S. economic support for El Salvador military would also mean blocked access to legalization in the United States, Salvadoran migrants headed north by the thousands. Many of these migrants, who were also parents, thought it would be safest to leave their children in El Salvador. Their main priority was immediate survival. In some cases, they would have endangered the children and their families to make contact or try to bring them along. These migrants had survived attacks or received targeted threats. For them, the decision to migrate was often in response to imminent danger. This was the case for Jorge. He was one of four siblings who grew up in a rural area of central El Salvador. His father owned a small coffee farm where the family worked the land. They did well enough to put Jorge and his siblings through high school. As a result, they were able to acquire white-collar jobs in a nearby city. When I asked him why he chose to migrate to the United States, he responded, "It was something unexpected. Well, you could call it political because I had problems with the military. I lost almost half of my family that night. I mean, I didn't. I never thought to come to this country. Never. I had my siblings, a brother and a sister, were here, and they had asked me and my other brother if he wanted to come. But we never wanted to come because we were not doing so well, but we were not doing poorly either. I was a secretary for a court in central El Salvador. We had no reason to come here, right? We were doing well. Jorge's wife worked in an office setting, also contributed to their household finances, and they were raising their family in a relative economic stability. When they can enjoy the fruits of their labor and feel safe from political violence, many families like Jorge's would prefer to remain in El Salvador. Jorge emphasized several times during the interview that he had tried to remain neutral regarding the Civil War. He wanted to protect his family and steer clear of the violence. As the war escalated, however, things became dangerous in their town and his work duties changed. He was now required to accompany the coroner to identify the bodies of those killed during warfare. They prohibited us from leaving the city. We were no longer going to identify bodies of the people they killed outside the city, those people were buried just like animals, and that kept increasing. By that time, he and his siblings had bought a home for their parents in San Salvador, away from the rising violence in his small town. He hoped that with his parents in the city, they and the rest of their extended family would be safe. Soon, 2 of his nephews and several of his friends joined the guerrilla movement, fighting for a more fair redistribution of wealth in the country. Meanwhile, Jorge remained strong in his conviction to stay neutral. He continued in his job of identifying the deceased and thought that if he stayed out of the conflict, he would be safe, but his resolve began to waver when he lived through a close call in his own family. What made me explode was one time that they captured my father, a man who at the time was 70 years old, and they captured him because he would come on Saturdays to visit me at my house, right? And he would go to his farm every Saturday. That day, he had been to my house around 4 p.m. He left my house, said, "Okay, I'm leaving." But around 4:30, I got a call. A woman, one of my cousins, calls me and tells me that they had captured my father. She saw them taking him in handcuffs. Jorge and his brother contacted everyone they knew until high-ranking officer in the military, someone who had been their childhood friend, helped them locate their father at a local prison and promised he would not be killed. Jorge realized that had it not been for his connections, his father would have been executed that very night. Even though he was not involved in the conflict, indeed indiscriminate violence was common and many people were murdered senselessly, sometimes because they were considered to be guilty by association, if not by actual involvement. Jorge was shaken by his father's arrest and near execution. The incident made him begin to question his neutral position, but he was ultimately convinced to get involved after witnessing a horrific scene left by the military. Jorge received a call from his friend who owned a farm just outside the city. His friend needed help moving a dead body found next to the cows that needed to be milked. So I go get to the coroner, and he doesn't want to go because it's outside the city. But I convince him that it's close enough and that it's a favor for a friend. So I make him go, and I walk in, and I see the cadaver just thrown there. I saw how many wounds he had and how he had been stabbed. I wrote up my report, and I turn around, and a neighbor whispers to me, "Hey, there's a hand over there." So I ask where, and I thought the man I just saw had both of his hands intact. Well, I saw it. It was, in fact, there, the hand. So I tell the coroner, and we find another body. We write up the report, and I remember heading into the house, and the door was halfway open, and I kick in the door, and I will never forget. I saw something that I still to this day comes to my mind, and I still can't fully digest it. I see a lot of people one on top of the other. The first one maybe like 3 months old, a boy. They had cut him with a machete right here. Points to his abdomen, even with his bottle in hand. And then on top of him, a woman. She was pregnant, actually, and on top of her, children. The first was 3 months. The second was like 1.5. The third was, more or less, I'm guessing their ages. The others were like about 4 years old. Another was around 7. Then there was the lady that I told you about. Then there were 3 men, older between 30 and 40 years old. 9 people in one bed, but the bed didn't even have covers. They were just there, like they had been left there that way to create terror. That's what made me change my life around, and I said, no more, I have to do something. Jorge had several friends who were already involved in aiding the guerrillas. Their goal was to defeat the military, which only ever seemed to protect the property and the rights of the wealthy elite. He decided to support the leftist coalition by providing them access to confidential information he retrieved from work. Some time passed in this way when one day in 1982, several of his relatives were kidnapped. He learned that the assailants had come by his house looking for him, but had missed him by just minutes. Knowing that he would be caught, likely tortured and killed any day, he decided his next step would be to take up arms and join the guerrilla fighters, having convinced his brother to also join. They went to say goodbye to their mother, but she ultimately persuaded them to leave the country. Instead, under imminent danger, they had to leave that same night. Unsure of where to go as they headed out, they decided to go to the United States to join their older siblings. As a matter of life or death, Jorge said goodbye to his wife and their son, but had no choice to look for his ex-wife and their two sons who lived in another city. He and his brother headed north without a guide, money, or concrete plans. They left El Salvador during the early stages of the war. His brother returned 6 years later in 1988 to reunite with his children, but Jorge remained in the United States, where he worked to bring his current wife and their child. He also reestablished ties with the two sons from his first marriage and sent them monthly remittances until they reached adulthood. Throughout the 1980s, tens of thousands of people left the country in situations similar to Jorge's, fleeing the horrors of the Civil War. Although much of the violence was indiscriminate, boys and young men were especially likely to be forcibly recruited into the fighting, making them feel more directly threatened. The U.S. government's steady funding of the military allowed the war to last as long and spread as extensively as it did. The daily violence and its sheer brutality, as committed largely by soldiers and paramilitary leaders, and to a lesser extent by guerrilla fighters, made it impossible for people in certain communities and university students throughout the country to live safely there. By that period, previous migration, even though rather limited, had established links between Salvadorans and the United States, the closest country they perceived as safe, politically stable, and economically strong. Weak economy. Along with the political violence, another source for Salvadorans' mass migration was the weak economy. El Salvador is a small country with a long history of only limited economic growth, but the Civil War period was especially devastating in the 1980s. The lowest levels of growth over the last 100 years since the Civil War ended in 1992. The level of political and military violence has decreased, but other forms of violence persist and economic circumstances remain stagnant. After a slight improvement in the early 1990s, the economy took another plunge in the first decade of the 21st century. During this period, El Salvador had the lowest growth rate in the entire Central American region. Some speculate that dollarization of the national currency in 2001 is largely to blame for that decade's economic woes. The administration of President Francisco Flores passed the law of monetary integration to infuse the economy with U.S. dollars that would presumably attract greater foreign investment and trigger economic growth. On the contrary, however, overall inequality has worsened. Under presidency of Antonio Saca, 2004 to 2009, the external debt of the small nation rose to a staggering $9.8 billion. And on the streets, because it was difficult to calculate between currencies, people had to pay higher prices because merchants rounded up. Despite the overarching failures of dollarization, the United States continues to be the most important trading partner for El Salvador, in addition to the 2 billion Salvadorans who reside in the United States, generate through remittances upwards of 15% of El Salvador's gross domestic product, GDP. But as the US dollar loses value worldwide, there are notable repercussions in the tiny country as well. Each cycle of market has loss heightens of the asymmetries of the Central American Free Trade Agreement and further deepens social and economic inequalities. In such context, only a few can truly thrive. The men and women in this study had implemented several strategies, worked in multiple industries, and commuted to different areas of the country in search of sufficient wages to feed their families or fund their children's continuing education. After feeling that they had exhausted all their possibilities, migration became the only remaining viable option. With so many Salvadorans already living in the United States, most people had relatives, friends, or neighbors with whom they could stay with. Those who did not had developed the sense that if others had made it, they too could be successful. Within these shared circumstances, however, there were clear gendered reasons for choosing migration. Gendered reasons for migration. Regardless of whether they migrated before, during, or after the Civil War, men and women had different reasons for leaving. Reasons that were informed by conditions that affected men and women differently. Though this was not initially evident in their narratives, when I asked mothers and fathers to tell me about what led to their migration, invariably the first response pointed to either political or economic reasons. Fathers who migrated during the period of the Civil War were more likely to attribute to their migration to political reasons. They or someone close to them was being persecuted, and it came down to a matter of life or death. Mothers and those who left after the official end of the war in 1992 cited economic reasons: a lack of jobs, no space for upward mobility, and a general inability to guarantee financial stability, access to health care, and basic schooling for their children. It took further questioning to uncover the gendered patterns in their reasoning and need for migration. About half of their fathers and 1/3 of the mothers I interviewed came to the United States before or during the Civil War. The men, as most frequent targets of recruitment, were fleeing direct political violence, like Jorge Milton also described involvement followed by a need to flee. In the 1980s, Milton was an engineering student at the Universidad de El Salvador, UES, the only public national university. Like many students at the time, he became involved because he was learning about the injustices that had made attending school nearly impossible for his working class family. Though he never took up arms himself, he did attend student meetings to discuss the war and ideologically supported the cause of the leftist guerrilla movement. In fact, the UES was a central meeting place for activists. They tried to connect the aims and philosophy of the guerrilla movement to the rest of the population who could have benefited from a thorough restructuring of the Salvadoran economy. When the fighting increased and the UES was attacked, Milton dropped out of school. With stories circulating of dozens of university students being tortured and killed or disappeared, he was nervous about being targeted as well. His girlfriend at the time, moreover, was feeling the stress of having been involved in aiding revolutionaries to hide weapons in her home and later in giving them access to her employer's safe in a staged holdup. As the violence escalated, although she was never directly threatened, she worried about her children's continued safety in the country and contacted her sister in the United States with the intention of joining her. She and Milton had been in a relationship for several years, fearing for his life. He decided to follow her. Having lost touch with his own children's mother, he left without saying goodbye to them, only to reestablish and sustain better contact later from the United States. Like Jorge and Milton, other men describe similar stories of fleeing direct political threats during the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. For some, migration would lead to their first separation from their families, but others had distanced themselves from partners and children prior to migration. There was a different pattern, however, among the migrant women during this same time period. All of the migrant women in this study who left during the war were single mothers and heads of households. The war had not played out forcefully in their towns, but they were worried about the escalating violence. Moving in search of work elsewhere in the country would put them at risk, so they felt they had no other options to provide for their children. Gloria, for example, migrated in 1986 in the middle of the Civil War. It had been several months since she had separated from or even heard from her children's father. She sold rice and beans at the local outdoor market, but her earnings were simply not enough to buy food for her four children. She was in a small town in central El Salvador where they heard much about the war, but had not yet experienced local attacks. Her goal was to leave to make enough money to one day take her children to live with her in the United States, away from violence. Imagine that I didn't have a place to go, but that desperation of knowing that if I didn't do anything, those kids would die. No, I said, I can't stay here because besides my mother was already older and she didn't want to work anymore. She had it rough all her life too, right? So by coming here, the idea was that I'd work and help all of them. I was not going to do anything there. There was nothing to gain in staying to wait for what? I had nothing to hope for. Even when not in direct physical danger during the Civil War, with the economy in shambles, single mothers like Gloria, who had no one else to rely on for financial assistance, looked to migration in those moments of desperation. Some women began to negotiate and redraw the contours of motherhood to include international migration as an acceptable path to provide for their families' pressing needs. During the war, men in this study left El Salvador to flee the consequences of a dangerous political context, regardless of whether they had children. Unlike women's situation, men's migration was not tied to their parental responsibilities, and several of them had already distanced themselves from their children. Women, on the other hand, sought migration as an extension of their parental responsibilities in a context of economic hardship. After the signing of the peace accords in 1992, Salvadorans continued to migrate in large numbers. No longer fleeing direct political violence, men and women were still unable to live up to their gendered expectations as providers for their children and other relatives. Balmore, who had lived in the United States for 15 years when I met him, recalled that he had to make a quick decision to leave after losing his job and not having money to save up for his mother's urgent medical expenses. Look, I was so unsure of what to do. My mom was getting worse and worse, and I was the oldest of my siblings. I would help her however I could. The problem was when I got laid off from my job. See, I had been working there for several years at this company, and it's not that they paid me very well, but we were making ends meet. The thing was that my girlfriend at the time, she got pregnant. And that's when I felt the responsibility. I was going to be a father, and I was working and everything. We were getting ready for our son. He turned out to be a boy, right? And that's when I lost my job. There were a few months left before he was born, but then suddenly my mother got very ill. So how was I going to cover her medicines and medical expenses? That's why I had to leave. Notably, despite not being legally married, Balmore aspired to fulfill gendered expectations and be a provider for his child and ailing mother. Later in the interview, he shared that he probably would have taken his time to find another job if his mother's health hadn't taken a turn for the worse. These unexpected and dire expenses were enough to push him to migrate. 26-year-old Antonio had only been married for a few years. He was an active member of an evangelical church and a devoted family man. He volunteered to speak to me after a presentation I made about my project to his congregation. But he asked that he asked that we do the interview in a private location where he could speak freely. Although he had been in the United States for over 3 years, it still pained him noticeably to talk about being away from his daughter and wife. He wept through several moments during the interview. When he remembered how he made the decision to leave, when he recounted the difficult journey across borders, and when he discussed the pain of missing his family, deciding to come to the United States was not easy for Antonio. As the oldest of his male siblings, however, he represented their best hope of survival. He had already dropped out of high school and worked several years in the field alongside his father, where he learned of the financial risks of being farm workers. When he was growing up, they typically had a small margin of profits, but more recently they either had no profits at all or they ended the crop cycle in debt. In those difficult years, the sum of their earnings failed to cover the costs of the increasingly expensive seeds for their crops. As the sole provider for his own young family, moreover, Antonio felt overwhelmed by their bleak future. He had been living with his wife and daughter in his father-in-law's home, where they lacked privacy and space. Having worked full-time during the week and overtime with his father on weekends for a number of years, he learned that it was impossible for someone of his socioeconomic and educational background to achieve stability and progress in El Salvador, even when he did everything within his reach to fulfill his responsibilities. You know how it is in one's country. I've been working since I was 16 to help my family. The last 3 years before I came, I was working in a factory making clothes, a maquilla. I was working Monday through Friday, about 8 hours a day, and then the next week I would work the night shift and go back and forth every week. I was making about $200 a month. I also helped my father work the land on the weekends. I was the only one working because my wife was home with my daughter, and she had taken care of her parents too. So we had that conversation, and she agreed that I had come to, if we wanted to do something more with our lives, get our own house, and have something to leave our daughter. Because in El Salvador, it is very difficult to buy your own house. We were never going to do it if I didn't come. Antonio's father and his young brother, already in the United States, convinced him to leave. Between the two of them, his brother had said, they could ensure the well-being of their parents and their younger siblings, and Antonio would have enough to guarantee a solid future for his own wife and daughter. Hesitantly, Antonio agreed when his father and brother offered to lend him the money for the trip. He could pay them back after working in the United States with so much pressure. He felt it was his duty as a responsible son, husband, and father to take this risk to improve his family's lot in life. Study participants' narratives suggest that Salvadorans' masculinities prescribed the role of economic provider to adult sons and fathers. This was true across different social strata and evident in men's explanations of their decisions to migrate. 50-year-old Felipe, for example, had lived a fairly comfortable life in El Salvador for many years. Although his brother had been disappeared during the war, never to be seen again, his family remained in the country with the hope of finding his brother one day. After finishing high school, Felipe also completed a technical degree. He worked as the leader of a nonprofit organization for many years, and although his wife's Blanca's combined income, they were solidly middle class. The shrinking economic opportunities set the conditions for his migration. In 2000, he opted to migrate when it seemed that all other avenues for making money in El Salvador were closed to him. I would go out and teach people in the countryside how to read and teach them business skills so they could make more profits. But after some years, we ran out of money, and I wasn't making enough money. My 3 kids were in private school, and my wife and I couldn't keep up with all the expenses. I looked into possibilities for investing some savings that we had. I tried everything. We bought some property. We even tried to open up a small store from our house, but nothing worked. That's when I started thinking about coming to work for a while. It took a long time because my wife and I had to go 3 times to the U.S. Embassy before they gave us both a visa. The goal was for each of them to travel periodically, find ways to establish business ties, maybe buy things in the United States to sell for profit in El Salvador, and vice versa, as they had seen others do. Everything from cheese and pastries to wholesale trinkets to makeup. From Felipe's vantage point, migration had worked well for the other middle-class families who could travel with visas, so they chose this option. Unlike poor and working-class families, middle-class families had more choices about when and how they wanted to pursue migration, and this gave them some agency in avoiding the consequences of U.S.-produced illegality. In the late 1980s, Amanda, who considered herself a member of the middle class, had acquired a multiple entrance visa to the United States. This permitted her to come and go over a 10-year period, so long as she did not violate the terms of the visa by staying more than a few months at a time. Her experience of choosing when and how to migrate reveals the gendered and classed processes of migration decisions. The reason I came last time, the story is that I wanted my son to come. He was 14 at the time, and the whole thing with the threat from the guerrillas, I just wanted him to leave the country. But they would not grant him a visa because they said he had to go with an adult. So the 3 of us, my husband, my son, and I went to request a visa, but they only granted me one. And you know how difficult it is to get a visa, so you have to use it so that you don't lose it, or so that you can renew it. So I had to come and make sure to use it, they told me. The opportunity is for you. You need to go. There's the only reason I came by myself that time. I didn't want to stay because they were too busy, or they were too young. He was 14 and my daughter was 4. That's why I didn't stay. During the war, her teenage son, like all boys in that age group, was under constant threat of being forcefully recruited to fight by either the military or the guerrilla fighters. Many families were desperate to get their male children out of the country to avoid the forced recruitment practices that were so widespread. Boys were taken away while playing on their street, riding a bus, or leaving school because it was so rare for any Salvadoran to be granted a visa. Visa recipients like Amanda feel compelled to travel and return to their country as a way to prove that to the U.S. Embassy that they can afford to travel and that they choose to return to El Salvador. This allows individuals to establish a strong record to support their case for visa renewals in the future in case they ever need to travel. Excuse me. During her first trip, Amanda stayed for only a couple of weeks. Look, when I came in 1990, my brother would tell me over and over to stay. If I had done so, I even would have qualified for amnesty. But my children were more important to me. I knew that the war was still going on and my son had already been threatened, so I was not going to be comfortable so far away from them. Although she would not have actually qualified for legalization, Under the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, properly known as amnesty, it is possible that Amanda could have applied for residency through other measures, or at least, the very least, been eligible for temporary protected status. This cook doesn't want to stay open. Sorry about that. Because she did not feel overwhelmed financially at that moment, she opted at most parents would to remain with her children. Unlike very poor families in El Salvador, Amanda used her privilege to prioritize her children over the economic advantages of working in the United States. She had the resources to conform to traditional constructs of motherhood and remain with her family. In so many other cases, however, family unity is not a realistic option. In fact, just over 10 years later, family unity was no longer a realistic option for Amanda either. She suddenly hit hard times, and in that new context, she was forced to consider migration. After her divorce, she began to manage her parents' neighborhood store to make up for her husband's lack of economic support. She had recently stocked the store to replace what had been sold for all the New Year's Eve celebrations when a powerful earthquake hit the country on January 13, 2001. All bottles and containers had fallen from the shelves and broken into millions of pieces. The liquid splattered and ruined the cigarettes and other products that would have been her only source of income at the time. Devastated by her losses, she had to act quick to get the money to pay back the companies that had recently delivered the materials. Her system was that she would receive shipments and pay for the merchandise on the sales representatives the next visit, when she also got to keep some profits. The earthquake, however, had destroyed most of her inventory, and the companies, including well-known global soda and ketchup brands, were inflexible. She had to pay them immediately or face stiff penalties on a sum that kept growing because of impossibly high interest rates. From one day to the next, she suddenly owed $100,000 colognes, roughly US $11,400, with no possibility of further credit and no other source of income. Without delay, Amanda applied for a bank loan to cover the expenses for all the lost materials. She spent the following 6 months waiting for a reply from the bank, only to learn that she had been denied the loan. As a backup plan, and only because she had run out of options, she thought to use her multiple entrance visa to the United States. In her previous trip, she had used it to visit her family over a short stay, but this time she would use it to enter the country, stay indefinitely, and earn money to pay off her debt. Amanda attributed her dire situation to her divorce. Without her husband's continued economic support, she and her children would not be able to survive financially. I would think that with a family intact, there may not have been any reason to migrate, but with the current economic situation, I think everyone thinks of leaving. As the national economy worsened for vast sectors in the country, the blocked paths to economic stability forced more and more people, including those from the middle class, to consider migration and family separation for survival. Members of the middle class, like Amanda, would be more likely to attain visas and plan out their trips. Most families I spoke with, however, face greater limitations and negative contexts when deciding to migrate. Poor and working class women in particular had few resources or support for these mothers, most of whom had already been working outside the home. Migration was the last option they wanted. It pushed them further from the already unattainable traditional gender ideologies, so they had to negotiate their definition of motherhood to include international migration and risks that endangered their lives as part of their responsibility to provide for their children. Recall the story of Esperanza, whose case open this chapter, her daughter's father was never present, never a source of financial support. So when she could not earn enough money to buy milk for her toddler, migration became the only option for her being a good mother. The only way to earn more money to ensure such basic necessities. Several mothers described being in similarly urgent situations. Mariana's case was one such example. With only a 6th grade education, she had worked selling produce in an outdoor market for years and knew that she would be limited to the informal sector where she would never earn sufficient wages. When she could no longer count on her partner's financial support, it became impossible to provide for her children on her own. I was married to him for 7 years, but he was a sick person, sick with jealousy, and I can say that there was also domestic violence in my home. But one day I just said, okay, this is it. And that's the day that I left him. I left the home and went to my parents with my 2 children. 3 days after that, I heard that the guy who helped people cross the border to the United States was leaving on a trip. So I decided to come with him. That was the quickest way to escape my problems at home. LA. Did you think about staying in El Salvador? It's just that wasn't an option. I had always worked in the outdoor mercadillo, since I was a child, and I barely earned pennies. Unos centavos. When the children's father, didn't give us money, I had to go around borrowing money. And I couldn't keep doing that all the time. My parents were getting older and they couldn't help us as much either. That's why I made that decision. Even my mother told me it was the best thing to do. Oops. Morena's negotiation of her motherhood responsibilities was an ongoing process. At some point, it included acceptance of domestic violence, but this changed, bringing with it full economic responsibility for her children. Under those circumstances, and with little reflection, she, with support from her own mother, reconstructed motherhood to also include an act of international travel in search of work. Morena's story of domestic violence, irresponsible partners, poor extended family, and a general lack of options was similar to those of several other mothers in the study. 36-year-old Angela, for example, described her situation prior to migrating the first time. Although it was during the war in 1988, she and her family did not face any direct political threat. Instead, she had to respond to constant physical attacks from her husband. The father of her 3 children growing up poor, Angela had not ventured much beyond her small town near the western city of Santa Ana. She met her partner in high school, dropped out in the 10th grade when she got pregnant, and moved in with his family. Then the couple moved out on their own with their 3 small children in the poorest sector of town, where they could afford to live on only his salary. Over the years, he became an alcoholic and slowly grew dangerously irresponsible. For a long time, Angela did not leave her husband because she relied on him financially. Money was especially tight for them due to many costly medical expenses. It was very difficult for me because my little girl suffered from epilepsy. At a year old, she had started to have seizures, and I was always needing to come up with money for her medicine, doctors. And it's a great expense. Those things are very expensive there, too expensive. The doctor's visit alone was sometimes 80 colones, about $9. They would give her a small bottle of medicine that had 80 drops that would last 15 days, and it cost in those days 80 colones. And it was just her medicine. Aside from that, also had to buy her vitamins because she always had to be taking vitamins just in her medical expenses. I'd spend at least 300 colognes, about $34. I had to come up with somehow because it was necessary to take her to the doctor every month. So that was my biggest worry. I was worried that I had to have that money or she would have died or she'd still be sick. In her experience, motherhood involved enduring violence to ensure that her daughter had the medical treatment she needed. It was the sacrifice she made for her children. In an attempt to stabilize things, when her husband started drinking, Angela went to work on his auto mechanic business, helping him with paperwork and cleaning up the place. But he began to falsely accuse her of flirting and eventually of sleeping with clients. The beatings came more often until she could no longer tolerate the situation. Angela took her children and moved back in with her parents, who lived a 15-minute walk away. Her husband tried to see her. He would show up drunk at her parents' home and create great stress for her family. Though he had never tried to hurt the children or her parents, he was unwilling to let her go. So within weeks and with the help of her father, Angela was set to leave to the United States with a smuggler. It was a way to distance myself from the problem, even though I was leaving my 3 small children. And that was the hardest part, but my father helped me in the sense that he asked if I wanted to come. He could set everything up for me, so I said yes. Did he suggest it at first, or did you come up with the idea? No, he suggested it because sometimes you stay over there and then the children's father would not stop bothering me. And I didn't want to, and I could not return with him, so I agreed. My father took charge. He told me not to worry about my kids, that they had a house to live in, even if they just ate beans and tortillas. They would have food, he told me. So I didn't have any doubts, even though I was leaving my children, which was the hardest part. Having suffered the violence for a number of years, Angela reached a tipping point with the urging of her father and the guarantee that her children would be safe. Migration represented a chance to provide for her children as a single mother. It is important, however, that Angela's migration decision was most critically rooted in her need to escape physical abuse. Angela lived and worked in the United States for 2.5 years, saving and remitting as much money as she could. She returned in 1990, just before Christmas, to spend the holidays with her children. Unfortunately, the financial situation quickly became dire after only a couple of months. Angela once again had to consider migration. I saw everything around me, and I saw no future. Really, I did not see a future, and while I don't have formal schooling, I am not an educated woman or anything of the kind. I had simply been a housewife, and I helped my husband in his job. So I would look around me and see the poverty everywhere. And I would see my children and I would say, no, I saw them. I know they are well. They saw me, so I know. So now I have to go back to the United States so that they can go to school or have something better. I decided again to leave. As much as mothers want to remain with their children, the financial conditions, especially for single mothers, make it difficult to provide sufficiently for their families. In fact, Angela tried to leave twice, but was caught by authorities in Guatemala and sent back each time. After 2 failed attempts, she decided to stay in El Salvador and do her best to support her children there. For the following 7 years, she had multiple jobs. First, I worked as a maid in this one woman's house. Then I would help out a dentist, but the pay was too low. Then they helped me find a job in San Salvador, in the capital. I was a maid for this family. He was a military man and his wife had been in the military too. But they were cruel like no one else. They were going to pay me 250 colones, just under $30 per month. And it was a 2-story house, and I was supposed to clean out every day, cook, wash, iron, and take care of everything in the house. She was trying to give me the workload of 2 people, so I quit after 15 days. I told her it was too much work and too little pay, and I wanted her to pay me for the days I had completed, but she got mad and didn't even pay me for bus fare. Angela's daughter's monthly medical expenses were higher than her earnings. Clearly, she would not have been able to cover her family's basic needs. She went on to work for another family for 6 months, but things did not work out there either because, as with most jobs for women in El Salvador, the wages were miserable. Finally, she heard about a job in a garment factory. She applied, was hired, and ended up staying several years. There, I earned well, with overtime and all that. Like sometimes I did 24-hour jobs that they called day-long jobs, jornada unicia. When there was a very large order, they had us work for 24 hours straight. Yes, dangerous, but I needed the money. So with that, sometimes I would make 900 colones, just over $100 every 15 days. At the very least, I would make $780. And that was huge because I could pay my mom $500, US 57, $446. And the rest I would invest in my daughter's illness because she was undergoing treatments. Angela's job was far away from her town and required that she spend the work week renting a room in the city to avoid 2-hour bus commute each way. She considered these to be sacrifices any mother would make because they allowed her to be with her children every weekend. As Angela's case reveals, however, poor and working class families have little access to health care in El Salvador. Often people simply do not earn enough to cover medical expenses, particularly when a loved one has a reoccurring health problems. Even when employed more than full-time in job sectors available to women in Angela's case, these included domestic and garment work. Working class single mothers are unlikely to make ends meet. Unaffordable health care, too, is an important reason for migration. Her efforts paid off for several years, though she was gone much of the time and was always just a crisis away from being unable to provide for her children again. But the cost of living continued to increase in El Salvador. In the economic climate, it became more and more difficult for poor and low-income families to make ends meet. Angela, who is working in maquila, the kind that have become one of the very few options for employment in the country, could not keep up with the increasing cost of living. Her daughter underwent several tests, and Angela could no longer afford her family's monthly expenses. There was a day when I didn't have a single cent to take to the hospital or to pay for her doctor's visit, not even for the bus fare, because things were getting more expensive. So that day, the only thing I could do was get on my knees and entrust her to God, for God to do a miracle. Either take her or let me keep her, but in good health. And I can tell you that the miracle did happen, because that's right around the time my brother called. My brother, who was here. It was 1998. He said, "You know what? I have enough money for someone to come if anyone wants to come." That is rare, but it happened. Angela still hesitated. She wanted to see her children grow. Didn't want to miss their adolescence. Having lived for years on the brink of losing her daughter to illness because she could not afford her medical care, she decided once again to leave. In that context, work already kept her physically absent much of the week, so migration became an extension of her mothering, allowing her to meet her daughter's needs more effectively, like Angela. Many mothers resisted migration. Motherhood, as they had been taught, meant that they had to be present and reliably available for their children, taking care of their daily needs in the face of abandonment, domestic violence, severe poverty, and a lack of educational or job opportunities, and in the context of increasing cost of living and inaccessible healthcare, they had to renegotiate motherhood to also include migration as another acceptable path to fulfill maternal responsibilities. What should be clear from both mothers' and fathers' narratives is that migration and the choice to come to the United States are not as simple nor unobjectionable as public debates about immigration in this country suggest. Migrants do not come to the United States ostensibly to take jobs and weaken economy. Rather, it is often the case that in increasingly unequal economic context and feeling unprotected from physical violence, migrants who would rather remain with their loved ones view migration as the only available measure to save their own lives and provide for their families. Mothers and fathers in particular act out of a desire to fulfill their parental responsibilities. These responsibilities are powerful, delimited by gender ideologies and class positions that inform migrants' decisions, justification, and feelings of guilt surrounding migration. Women, like men who migrated after the end of the Civil War, explained that they were forced to leave due to economic reasons. As I prodded, however, fathers in line with gender ideologies emphasized a desire to provide for their families, their children, partners, and parents. This was the core of their reasoning for migration, and most of the time they did not have to explain further or feel apologetic, because they were feeling expectations, setting themselves up to be better economic providers. In my conversations with mothers, on the other hand, I had to peel through multiple layers to get to the heart of their migration decisions. Women migrated only after more severe situations had forced them to go against traditional notions of motherhood, to leave their children instead of being present with them on a daily basis. With the support of encouragement of families and friends, women negotiated and redefined motherhood to make migration acceptable as the most viable and immediate solution for their families. Subdued optimism in the face of despair. Pardon me. As difficult as it was to leave their children under the care of others, many parents, both mothers and fathers, shared a sense of subdued hope when embarking on their journey. After attempting to do everything within their power to work and provide for their families in El Salvador, in a climate of rising costs and shrinking opportunities, especially for women, the United States represented the final available measure to achieve success as parents. Whether it was because they could not afford private school, had not been able to save up for college, did not have the money to pay for the required uniforms in public school, could not raise the money for costly medical care, or did not earn enough to feed their families consistently, migration emerged as the safest bet they could make to improve their family's future. Cognizant of the many dangers and unknowns that awaited them on their journey, and inside the United States, a country where they did not know the language or the culture, where they would be so far, very far away from their loved ones, and everything that they knew, migrant parents' reserved sense of hope is noteworthy. Angela, for example, had resisted leaving her children, but ultimately remembered her journey in the following way. On the trip here, aside from the suffering on the road and thinking about the children you are leaving behind, about the family and everything, you don't know what you'll find on the road or what will happen. You just think about getting away from the problem, about paving the way for your children to thrive, sacarlos adelante, about how to survive alongside them. Notably, Angela sees a future of mere survival for herself, but accepts this as a sensible goal so long as her children are thriving. Similarly, Marina, who migrated to avoid an abusive partner, had suffered tremendously on her way to the United States. says that she was able to keep going on the treacherous journey by reminding herself of her goals. What I wanted was to give them schooling, to give them what they needed for their expenses. I was coming here because this was going to give them the opportunity to study. That's what I was doing. Balmore, who left to secure money for his ill mother and unborn son, said, "To me, coming to the United States represented a certain type of hope. To me, I was coming to work hard in whatever kind of work, to send my mother money for the cost of her medical exams and to save her life." And Raphael, who left his wife and daughter, said, "I came thinking that this was the best thing I could do for them." Well, in my situation, notably, all of these parents described their migration as a choice, a moment reflecting their agency. Even when analysis of the broader context demonstrates that they had fewer other options. In the process, they did not express optimistic or unbridled hope. Rather, they moved forward warily because their first choice, to remain in El Salvador, was simply out of the question, and in that context, they had to prepare themselves mentally for the challenges ahead. Even when their migration decision was rooted in escaping political or domestic violence, the thought that their efforts would ultimately benefit loved ones helped propel them past the suffering. While most wished that they could have found a way to stay with their families and still make ends meet, El Salvador, particularly as influenced by U.S. foreign and economic policies, politically or economically, did not offer them those opportunities. Most parents grew up poor, unable to complete much more than an elementary or junior high school, because they could not afford bus fare for the commute or the required school supplies. These parents would have preferred to stay with or near their children. In some cases, the parents had already separated prior to migration. Surrounded by family and familiar culture, if they could have just had access to a dignified job that paid living wages, they would have been happy to stay in El Salvador. Had they known that in times of illness and other crises, they could have had access to health care and aid for their loved ones. The reality, however, was bleak. Pervasive inequalities and widespread poverty had prevented them from obtaining the education necessary for jobs that would grant them economic stability, and the remaining jobs simply did not pay livable wages. When the most of them could aspire to was $200 per month, and when the prices of basic food supplies and medical care were increasingly out of reach, they swallowed the pain of leaving their children and sought out the only strategy that, while difficult, would most likely lead to better results. This is the end of chapter 2. Thank you.